With this film, we want to introduce the didactic model for inclusive teaching and learning. It depicts the structures and processes of inclusive teaching and learning and their relations to one another. Its aim is to combine the numerous requirements of teaching and learning in heterogeneous learning groups in one model, even though the individual discourses are much more complex. In contrast to the terms exclusion and integration, inclusion in the field of education means that all people have the same opportunities to participate in high-quality education and to develop their individual potential, regardless of differences like special learning needs, gender, or social and economic prerequisites. The question is, how do lessons need to be designed to fulfill these goals? Of course, this question cannot be answered from an isolated perspective, and that is why the project FDQI-HU at Humboldt University has initiated a cooperation between experts in the fields of special needs education, inclusive academic language teaching, different subject-specific didactics, and general didactics. Together, this interdisciplinary team has developed a didactic model that follows didactic traditions while transferring these traditions to contemporary questions of inclusion. The model is based on ethical principles of inclusive teaching and learning and the self and world relation of individuals in school settings. The ethical foundations concern the protection of children's and human rights, in particular the rights to equality, participation, anti-discrimination, and appreciation. These goals can be seen as cornerstones of inclusive teaching and learning. The phrase self and world relation of individuals in school settings refers to education as a progressive transformation of this relation. When the learner's view on the world or on itself changes, learning, also according to Wilhelm von Humboldt, is taking place. Hence, the didactic model aims at education as humanization and lifelong learning. Based on theoretical works and empirical studies, we identified the most significant process characteristics for inclusive education. That is participation, communication, cooperation, and reflection. Participation is defined through four aspects. Firstly, through the constitutive participation of all students without exclusion. Secondly, through aspects of democratic education and learning about democracy. Thirdly, through the activation of all students, and fourthly, through cooperative processes of joint teaching and learning. Communication is an essential part of all educational practices. In inclusive settings, it is also associated with the need for language education. All in all, this process characteristic focuses on appreciative communication and shared learning processes, since these processes have to be continuously communicated and negotiated, for example, with regard to goals, content, and learning methods. This is where cooperation is to be considered. Inclusive education is always geared towards cooperative practices. This aim refers to both the joint work of students as well as the cooperation of teachers, special needs educators, parents, and partners outside of school. And finally, reflection relates to the general requirement of the educational sciences to continuously observe themselves critically in order to develop further. In this sense, different practices in class, students' progress in learning, or teachers' own attitudes are to be reflected on a regular basis. These four process characteristics determine interactions in inclusive education, concerning both teachers and students. It is important to emphasize that these processes are not taking place isolated from one another, but in permanent interaction. The model's three circles represent the framework conditions in which inclusive teaching and learning is taking place. The societal conditions relate to problems of contemporary importance. The aim is not only to address contemporary deficits, but also to discuss the possible reproduction of societal problems in school education. After all, school education is always part of society and thus, in turn, has an impact on it. The individual subjects are being addressed in the circle subject-specific didactic conditions. This element of the model refers to how topics can be picked and organized so that they are both individually meaningful and professionally acceptable. School conditions relate to the specific educational institution and its opportunities for planning and implementing inclusive teaching and learning. This includes, for example, a school's internal curriculum, its equipment, or a school's educational concept. The center of the didactic model for inclusive teaching and learning consists of structural elements. These are fixed parameters in the structure and course of a lesson and are related to each other and to the other fields in the model. The structural elements are called baseline assessment, topics and content, methods and media, and progress monitoring. Baseline assessment describes the process of determining the student's status quo, both on the individual and on the group level. By knowing different situations and learning levels, it is possible to offer students in heterogeneous learning groups different approaches to achieve individual progress. The complex process of identifying students' capacities is one of the key competencies for inclusive education. Progress monitoring does not primarily refer to classic forms of assessments, but rather to continuously accompanying a process of teaching and learning, in which not only the result at the end, but the entire process is taken into account. Topics and content should alternate between the current interests, capabilities, and experiences of the learners, as well as the given subject specifics and teachers' perspectives, thereby providing room for differentiated viewpoints and approaches. The field of methods and media refers to conveying different content through different means and is also related to questions of baseline assessment and progress monitoring. Above all, this field is about finding the right fit for individual needs. It is not about constantly changing methods and media, but about how suitable they are for a certain teaching objective and for the individual learning group or student. The fundamental aim of inclusive teaching and learning, and thus the center of the model, concerns the individual development of competencies. Here it is important to understand competence in a broader sense, acknowledging not only the cognitive achievements of learners, but equally focusing on the individual, social, motivational, and the ethical normative dimensions of the term competence. The didactic model for inclusive teaching and learning can be used for planning, implementing, and analyzing lessons, and is also used in teacher education. You can learn more about how to apply the model in various contexts in the respective book or in the glossary. When developing the model, we deliberately sketched out a theoretical ideal, knowing that the current lack of resources and education policy strategies often impedes a comprehensive transformation of this ideal into practical use. Still, we are convinced that this ideal can be pursued through various ways and forms, approaching the goal of an education for all step by step.